Hello, welcome to another series from the Secretly Society. I'm Tom Davies. Back in the mid-90s, a group emerged from St. Louis, later moving to Chicago, and they'd go on to make some of the most beguiling and unique music of the time. They were 90 Day Men. In this three-part series, Tim Kinsella, a fellow Chicagoan and friend of the band, guides us through conversations with the members and other folks who were involved in the scenes and movements that they operated in, including myself in fact. Over 4 albums and a few EPs, the band's sound developed from angular post-something into elaborate, experimental, baroque songs, influenced by the world that was going on around them, and delving back into almost prog territory in 60s art rock and beyond. To my ears, 90 Day Men were not ahead of their time, they were of a different world entirely. I consider some of their records to be the best I've ever heard, let alone have the fortune to work on. 90 Day Men's discography and a handful of previously unheard songs were compiled into a 5 LP set by Numero Group in 2023. In this episode, Tim speaks to the band about the musical world from which they were born and how they came to be. Let's dive in.
Hello, my name is Tim Kinsella, and I come from a very, very distant place that you may have heard of before called the 1990s. I know it seems like a dream nowadays, but I swear I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. I was born in the Chicago suburbs in 1974, meaning that I was just about perfectly positioned culturally to witness up close and participate in and benefit from and get shaped by and ultimately let down by the impossibility of sustaining this golden age of the 1990s. Like many of us Gen X, I am fundamentally suspicious of ever referring to any kind of big we. You catch the irony in that statement, right? That's how we Gen X talk. But I will say this, people my age that were there in the 90s, all of our parents were either hippies or squares opposed to the hippies. And whichever one's particular case happened to be, we were all born into a moment of relative social progress. We all assumed that it was a done deal, that more equitable social and political advancement and opportunities would continue to expand to include more and more segments of society. And this assumption shaped our worldviews and therefore our ambitions. We had survived Reagan and got so cozy that Francis Fukuyama famously dared to claim that we'd reached the end of history. We had enough comforts and conveniences compared to previous generations that we could afford to get bored by the endless loop of Brady Bunch reruns and pine for more for ourselves and more for the world, a better world. So for me, and millions of other people, mostly young men and mostly white, this meant absorption in the DIY or indie rock scenes. These two scenes ultimately came to blend a bit, but they are not and never have been the same, and the tension between them is real. The DIY scene offered young people an opportunity to get out of their small town and see the world, so long as they were willing to put in the sweat, both in preparation and in the grueling travel itself. Ultimately, from a historical perspective 30 years later, I'd say Fugazi was the best living embodiment of the ethics we commonly strive to attain. And Sonic Youth is probably the best cultural artifact to contain the wide breadth of everything that could be included under our big tent of cool. And Nation Ulysses was probably the most impactful band of the era that is still not a household name, unlike many of the bands that they inspired. But to truly understand the moment, one has to consider how the social conditions and forces shaped the singular lives of specific people, how their gangs came to be, groups, how their groups came to be, who they each were, and how they fit into this thing, their gang. And then how their gang fit into this bigger thing, the musical underground. And maybe then one could hope to begin to understand what the world was then, and what exactly it is that we've lost in the decades since, thanks to technological evolution and social repression. Let's take, for example, the unusual but not uncommon case of the 90-Day Men. Brian, Casey, and Chandler all met and became friends while still in high school in the suburbs of St. Louis. It was the vibrant, all-ages DIY punk scene that brought them together. Scenes like this were common everywhere in those days, no matter the size of the town.
So we were all just kind of around. There was an all-ages club called Bastilles. No matter what the show, you just went there.
In St. Louis, it was not that easy to get shows in the city or whatever. And also, I mean, Brian was, I don't even know if he could drive when I first met him. Same with Chandler. They might have been 16. I'm a little older than them. But yeah, we'd all play this club out there, and just like that was the scene. It was like out in the middle of like Chesterfield, Missouri. It was pretty far out in the burbs. The county, as we called it, in St. Louis.
And everyone knew Casey and Andy because they were a couple years older than all of us, but they had a band. Casey had a band called Caffeine, and Andy had a band called Outcasts that were like the cool kind of bands in town.
Brian and I helped each other, like booking like out of town bands that we could find. I mean, this is back when, you know, you'd find out if the band was on tour, Maximum Rock and Roll or Fancy.
They were just better than the other bands. They were cool because they were good. Yeah. Everybody went to see them play. So you would go and there'd be tons of people who looked cool, and like you would just meet people at those shows.
We were all in high school at the same time in St. Louis, and
Same high school?
no, different high schools. And I think I met Brian just kind of through music. I've been hanging out with Ben Beasley, John Beasley, and just kind of met him at shows and stuff. And I remember the first day I went over to his house, and it was actually the day I had gotten my first bass that was my own. Went over to his house and we just kind of played a little and hung out. And then I ended up playing bass in the band that he had started at the time, which was Grimace.
You knew Rob already from
Brian knew him better than I did, but we would communicate with each other and be like, hey, let's try and bring whoever through, because we see they're on tour and they have days off.
You guys click well immediately?
Yeah, Brian and I, for sure. We got along pretty much right off the bat, and, you know, felt like we kind of known each other for a long time, pretty much right away.
I was the youngest guy in Caffeine, and all the other guys were like 2 years older than me, but I was like 2 years older than Brian and all those people. Chandler, those kids in Grimace and all that. So, you know, we would help them book shows.
Casey is a different kind of person, so it took a little bit longer to feel each other out and kind of figure out what our relationship would be like.
Caffeine was like kind of like a punk band. It was super fun. I loved doing it. But the drums were always something that I wanted to do.
So I had started a band with Ben and this other guy, Dan Demba, a little bit before meeting Brian. I don't really know how bass happened. I think just kind of talking to Ben, he was playing guitar and Dan was playing drums, and that was what was left.
I started playing the drums when I was like 18, and I lived in this house with a bunch of guys that played in that band Caffeine with me and whoever. It was like the first house I ever lived in outside of my parents. And Chandler, me, and John Beasley, and Andy started a band, goth band, called Shadow
Park.
Mm-hmm. I played drums in it, Andy sang, John was on guitar, Chandler was on bass.
It was a really good time in music for bass players. Fred from Hoover was big. Guess it was maybe a little bit after, but Trenchmouth, Circus Lupus, like just the way the bass was being used there was so much more interesting than what I was used to.
But as they finished high school, and it became time to start college. Like so many cool people everywhere, they gravitated to the regional big city, in their case, Chicago.
John and Chandler were like, hey, we're moving out of here. We're going to go to Columbia College. You should come and check it out. So I went with them up to Chicago, looked at the school. They had the program I was interested in. Chandler, John, and I moved up there together.
There was a practice space in the dorms at Columbia, so we played a bit there. We had a band in St. Louis called Shadow Park that Andy Lansingen sang for. Casey played drums, John played guitar, and Andy sang. And we kind of a little bit tried to keep that going, but kind of quickly got overwhelmed with school.
Chandler and Casey and John Beasley moved to Chicago to go to Columbia. And that was when they moved here my senior year of high school. So I was definitely leaving St. Louis. So they were like, why don't you come up here and we'll start a band?
Brian was like, I'm going to go to DePaul. When I move up there, we should start a band. And I was like, well, I'm going to be down there for the summer. Chandler will be too. Let's start a band when I'm back.
When we came back to St. Louis for that summer between our first year and second year, just started playing with Brian again because he was there.
They came back to St. Louis for like 2 months, maybe just 6 weeks. And we just wrote, our whole goal was like, let's write a set and play a show. So we did that. And then everyone split up and we met back up here in the fall of 95.
I started playing with Casey right when he first was playing drums. So I was just kind of with him as he was learning and kind of developing the style. So it always felt kind of natural to me.
We wrote that first set of songs, which was, I think, 6 or 7 songs. We wrote them in like a week or two and just played a show. And that was the document. Like, we're like, all right, now we can go to Chicago and we've got to start and we can figure out what we're going to do.
Casey and I were pretty far into maybe like horror rock, like TSOL, stuff that Brian was not so much into. So a little bit was kind of meeting in the middle. Brian's tastes at the time were just different. But we got along so well that we tried to kind of make it work. And I think it did work because Casey and I were so influenced by, bands like Bauhaus that we kind of had that rhythm conversation going. And then Brian brought in something totally different.
I had played in Shadow Park.
Right.
We had played, we played like maybe 2 shows. And I also loved that. Like, I loved playing drums live. It was so much fun. And with those guys, it was just like, we were just like so hungry for it.
Where'd the name come from?
It's from a book Casey had about criminal psychology. Like 90-Day Men are people who are under evaluation for a period of 90 days to decide if they're criminally insane or just criminal. It sounded cool, it looked cool.
I met them because I went to Columbia College. And the first time I hung out with Casey was my first time going to the Empty Bottle.
School was obviously just like a secondary thing to us.
My first class, my first day, my first college experience was English Comp 101. Casey and I were both completely zoomed in on the same goth girl that we were in love with. At that time, we took a break in the middle of the class, us both being like, dude, the girl is mine. The only girl is mine. I don't know if we were getting into one of those moments. The next thing I know, we're talking about shock mounted D112s and kick drums, and we both realized we were drummers and obviously had the same taste in goth girls. I know he and Chandler had been working on kind of loops of compound meter stuff. Just, we were all talking about, 9/11 and everything was in 7/8 and what happens if you play 5/4 against 6/8. We all thought that was the most riveting type of shit to talk about.
I guess I feel like we were in maybe the only place in the world where it could have been understood. Chicago really was the right place.
It was such like a crazy time because I had left my house for the first time and I was in a city that was way bigger than anywhere I'd ever been. So I felt like it was constant information.
There's like in the first shows, we all would wear the same color. There's some really silly pictures of that where we all had these like one color outfits. And we were into using samples quite a bit. So in the early shows, we would have these tapes that we'd mix together of soundtracks of different people speaking. I think I found a record of the McCarthy hearings, and we like just had that playing in the background but behind shows and stuff. Really just to try to make it feel not like other things that were out there, you know, and to add this sense of strangeness to things.
But we didn't feel like we were so different that we were like upsetting the natural order of things. Like, you know, like back then it was like, you know, you'd play with like, you know, bands with like, you know, like the sound like the Rentals or something, you know, like that was really big then. Like everyone had a keyboard all of a sudden, and then there was still like, you know, that kind of style of like emo band was coming up, like the extremely emotional, but hardcore was still everywhere. So it was like, every show was like varied. So it never felt out of place because there was no place.
Chicago is the third biggest city in the States after New York and LA. But even back then in the mid-90s, Chicago was affordable compared to the two bigger cities. This meant that people didn't have to hustle with the same intensity here, allowing more free time, and I would argue that these are the material conditions that made Chicago a hotbed for 90s music activity. The gang mentality of being in a band began to become more porous here, and people had time for side projects. There wasn't so much at stake, and this allowed people to expand what they could do, and it drew a lot of people to Chicago.
We went out to see music every night. It's you, and you know, we're all shoulder to shoulder, like what, 6-7 nights a week.
Everyone was at the same shows. Everyone, if they weren't going to see a show, then everyone was at Rainbow. And if everyone wasn't at Rainbow, it's like, then they were probably all practicing together.
Shows were so funny because like there were like girls would be sitting there doing the like one leg, like jerky, shaky thing. And then guys would just be staring and like some of them would be nodding. But it was like, it was always so funny to me, like how uptight everyone in the audience felt, but it's not uptight.
It was young women now are like, how did you put up with so much stuff back then? It's like, well, actually, like the guys in our scene were the best guys.
Like everybody was substantiating each other's like mainly terrible ideas and unrealistic expectations about creative energies at that time at like on a tsunami level of idiocy and drunkenness.
I'd say that the scene was made up of a lot of different types within the same umbrella, and so there were, you know, bands that were doing like poppier punk things. There were bands that would be more emo, and then there was bands that were like maybe in the kind of Gang of Four tradition of like angular. And I think that Churchwell lived in that kind of angular thing, and so when 98 Men appeared, I was kind of like, oh, dissonant, angular, choppy materials.
I mean, Chicago was kind of synonymous with it at the time. And I liked some math rock, and they would play shows with these math rock bands like Carl Saft's band or Big N or you know, Luster King or these kinds of things, but they weren't like those bands. There was this kind of it was almost like, I don't want to use the word emotional because that's also tied up with a genre that they were not a part of in any way. There was this almost more emotional, more like a deeper quality to the music that I don't know, it really hit me right away.
But it was just really cool to watch them kind of like move along because they really sounded like all of the weird Chicagos at once. Like they had that Fireside Bowl, like post-hardcore fluency, but they also had like the rhythmic, like fuck all of Scissor Girls or Trench Mouth. And then they also ended up kind of having this broad Chicago post-rock sweeping feel kind of on top of that.
Yeah.
So you just have this magical thing where a band sounds like a very distinct product of their musical ecosystem, but also entirely like themselves.
Chicago had the bands, and it had the labels, and in true classic punk fashion, it seemed attainable. If you were a teenager in Pittsburgh or Iowa, you may have been a fan of bands from New York and LA, but their professionalism still made them seem somehow set apart. But Chicago bands, doing what they did, somehow seemed attainable, striking a balance of both heightened cool while still relatively laid-back amateur.
We were like so into like Nation of Ulysses, like let's start a gang.
Yeah, we like went with this whole aesthetic. We'd all wear like monochrome outfits, like this whole thing. We're really Nation of Ulysses was like a huge influence for us back then.
Sure. What I really liked about them was that, to me, they were like this lost descendant of Trenchmouth. And then for me also, it was like they were my modern day Minutemen, you know? So they just had that language, you know, because there's such a rich history in Chicago of a lot of great dissonant stuff.
So I think at the time, you know, it's before social media and stuff. So if you wanted to present an image of your music, of what you were, you presented that image 24/7, you know, everywhere you went. If you went to the grocery store, you were doing it, you know, you were being 90 Day Men, or you were being Cap'n Jazz, or whatever the case was. So, and they definitely did that.
I personally think people miss my comparison when I say Minutemen, because I think when you talk about comparisons, people think it's a literal, and I'm like, no, in spirit, because obviously there's no replacement for D Boon or that band. You know, you don't get a chance to see that being your age, so you kind of stumble across your own versions of what that spirit is later on in life, and you can recognize that there's a similar thing. I feel like they could have fit in like Brian Eno's No Wave comp.
I remember specifically like Chandler getting Pink Flag and all of us just being like, what the fuck? Like, this is awesome. Like, how come I never heard this? It's so old.
We were like, you know, just the whole touch and go scene. We were immersed in, like, just loved all that music. And just also, you know, coming from like a city like St. Louis, when you move to Chicago, it's like, you're just, it's like overwhelming because there's so much music to see. Whereas like there, like, you know, bands would tour through there and stuff like that. But I mean, when we first visited, to see whether I wanted to go to Columbia or not, it was like the Jesus Lizard, Girls Against Boys, Brainiac were like playing at the Vic, and I was like, I've never seen a show like that like in my life.
By all accounts, Brian was already as easygoing and as friendly and as driven as he remains to this day. The modest aesthetic sensibilities that Brian would go on to cultivate for decades were already apparent, always prioritizing the song itself over his own expressiveness.
Brian's the type of person that if I came up and wanted to talk shit about somebody, he's that person who kind of goes, I don't know, they're pretty cool. I mean,
Brian's incredibly generous. You know, he and I have been like sending records to each other back and forth in the mail, and he's just like an incredibly kind and committed guy.
Brian was this like skulking, like little subversive thing coming through there. And when you talk to him, it was like a night and day difference. Like off stage was nice guy, and then on stage he was in character.
I can remember how exhausted Brian would look anytime we'd go out of town because Brian took care of everything.
He was the only driver's license.
Brian was like, he kind of held it all together. He was always driving. It seemed like, I don't think Rob had a driver's license.
Only Brian did.
Yeah. Wait, what?
Brian was the only one with a license.
Yeah, that's what I remember. He was always driving. He was always the guy who had to drive. So he was the guy who had to, you know, he wanted to have some drinks at the party, but he couldn't have too many because he had to drive the band to the hotel or the motel or whatever, or the next gig and so on.
Casey, on the other hand, though equally as easygoing, was practically an inversion of Brian. His friendliness always had a wry edge to it, and he felt deeply compelled to challenge himself on his instrument. And this tension went a long way in defining their sound, even early on.
When I think of 90 Day Men, I picture Casey's devil lock getting sweaty as hell and whipping around and like kind of like a teenage Jerry Only, kind of like a skinny teenage Jerry Only manning the drums.
You have Casey, who I think is like probably the most normal guy in the band in terms of like probably can kind of carry on a conversation with anyone. Just a friendly fucking guy, but serious about drums, serious about his instrument, and like such an, as we said, not to reiterate terribly, but such an incredible point of view with his way of playing.
Casey, of all four of those dudes, was probably the most private dude.
Casey is just fucking hilarious, and I don't know how to. He has this kind of dad energy to him, you know, when it comes to like them together, like on tour, you know, or something. It's like he doesn't care. He's kind of above it, but I think that's his strength. He's just kind of like, you know, whatever. But he's definitely the comic relief if you're ever feeling like shit. That guy is probably not going to let you feel like shit.
Even when we were young and these kinds of distinctions were primarily intuitive, Chandler always seemed strikingly smart, even on one's first impression. He was earnest, smiled often, but didn't goof around, and was an attentive listener. Of course, I was privy to this information because I was their friend and had these same compulsive habits in common. But even at the time, it seemed like common knowledge that they wrote songs by jamming and seeing what emerged from the collective sensibilities. This, of course, is diametrically opposed process to the ways that my bands so regularly operated, in which one person brought in a riff and everyone learned it. And this trust and this teamwork seemed completely in sync with how much they publicly presented as a gang.
The first tour, and Rob went with us on that.
Wait, was this when he was playing trumpet?
I booked half of it, and Rob booked the other half because it was supposed to be with his band, Savage. I had a car in high school. I sold that, got the van. We built out the loft like the day before we left. Played Kansas City, St. Louis, played Knoxville, where we met some people that we were friends with for years and years.
Yeah, we got this crazy Econoline van and, you know, built a loft in it and did the whole thing. And it's got a road atlas and they had that thing full of phone numbers. And I think, like, I mean, we'd have like 4 nights off in a row and stuff like that. Like,
right. Crashing with people.
Big time. First time we played in Manhattan, we played this place called Coney Island High. And promoter was just like, I mean, it was a terrible show. The promoter was just like, no, you don't get paid. None of that. It was awful. Terrible experience. And that place was totally just like this like punk throwback dive. And that was like the first time that we ever got fully stiffed and like met like a real promoter where he's just like, go fuck yourself. Like, you're not getting any money. Don't ever come back here again.
I feel like the like DIY or whatever you want to call it scene back then was super open to whatever was happening, as long as it wasn't like overtly negative in some way. So, right. You know, like I was saying earlier, like we just played with, you know, some nights was with all like keyboardy emo bands, and some nights was no one, you know, or like some weird dad hard rock band or something. Like we were playing anything. It was a tour set up by, you know, 18 and 20-year-olds in 1996. Like, it was terrible. But it was the beginning. I mean, by the end of that tour, Rob had joined the band and was moving to Chicago.
To understand what happens next and how it happens, I think it's important to reiterate how common all ages DIY scenes were in so many towns and cities of any size, and how connected these nodes all were to each other. While still living in Kansas City, Rob joins the band, expanding it to a quartet.
Like before Rob moved, we did play a few shows in St. Louis, and Rob would just meet us and just like, he just fucking dance and like shout. It looked cool. The energy was like so good. But we have some live recordings of that stuff, but we weren't really writing until he got here. So I think that was like a summer tour. So we knew that basically the deal was around Christmas or whatever, Rob would move to town.
I know that it was after we had moved out of that place in the Gold Coast where we all lived together. We're kind of scattered around the city. So there were some feelings of disconnection kind of happening there.
Rob and I shared a room for years. Not even an apartment, a room. We shared a room.
Brian was always, into school and everything, but I got so into the academics that like a lot of my time was getting swallowed up with that. So there was definitely a feeling of priorities being unclear.
I think Chandler had changed his mind about not about being in the band or about our personal relationships, but I think he wanted to like kind of pursue academia a little bit more and not in Chicago. And there was definitely some tension there.
Yeah, I decided to leave. Most of it was like about schooling and kind of like what I wanted to do in that angle. Like I had gone to Columbia for film and photography and then ended up switching to UIC and got into philosophy and political theory. And that was pulling me to go to New York. And so I just started thinking a lot more about that because this new world of study was really exciting me at the time. Like it just took over everything in my head. And, I think there were there was definitely some tensions there. Like, I was seeing someone and that, maybe pulling myself away and being pulled away through that. But, I think mostly it was just about, in part, knowing that Rob was there and that he was so good and that would be fine. That in some ways it stopped making sense because Rob was totally underutilized blowing on a trumpet. And so I definitely felt like, I don't know, I guess in this case, like a fourth wheel was starting to happen, like that extra feeling.
It wasn't personal, but it was because we were kids. Because I had been playing music with Chandler since I was like 16. So it had, at that point it was 5 years of like being in a band relationship with this person. So I was probably reacting a little bit more emotionally.
I feel like Brian was more hurt than anything. But no, not anything at all extra towards Rob. I didn't really feel like he came in and replaced me or anything, and I don't think that was his intention.
I knew it wasn't about me, but I was still bummed.
Damn, it stings, right? A lot of us, being in bands would eventually teach us everything that we know about anything. How to collaborate, how to balance one's own needs with the goals of the group, how to set small goals in service of larger goals, how to be a good neighbor, and how to write an invoice. And here is one of the toughest lessons that many people still struggle with: how to accept it when friends grow apart and no longer have the same goals. But of course, this is just the very beginning of a kinda long story, so tune in next time, you freak.
You have just heard episode 1 from the Secretly Society's 3-part series about 90 Day Men, narrated and written by Tim Kinsella. You can listen to playlists of 90 Day Men's music via the link in the show notes, or go ahead and check out any of their albums wherever you listen to music. And check back in the Secretly Society's archive for other shows about Jason Molina, Big Red Machine, Jens Lekman, and our ongoing series Secretly Frequencies, where we quiz artists about their catalogue and learn a little more about their histories. The Secretly Society podcast is an original production of the Secretly Group. The series was edited by Ben Swanson and Caroline Vector. The project manager for the Secretly Society podcast is Coco Segala. Robbie Morris is their creative director. Look out for more from the Secretly Society wherever you get your podcasts.